The race for the White House is in the home stretch. On the last weekend before Tuesday's presidential election, the two candidates have been making their last appeals to voters. They're focusing on the swing states that could determine who will become the next president of the United States. Vice President and Democratic candidate Kamala Harris was in Georgia and North Carolina, where she renewed her pledge to be a president for all Americans. She later flew to New York, making a surprise appearance on the TV show Saturday Night Live, where she said she'd end the drama in US politics. Polling still suggests the race is neck and neck. Former President Donald Trump was also campaigning in North Carolina. He promised to crack down on migration and cut taxes. DW has been looking at what people around the world think about the US election and asking what the vote means for them. This time, the focus is on Europe. Our Brussels bureau chief, Alexandra van Namen, has more on what's at stake.
If elected, will Kamala Harris forge closer ties with Europe? And if she loses, how disruptive could a second Donald Trump presidency be? Europeans do not get a choice in this election, but they will have to bear the consequences.
The United States is the most important partner for us in the European Union.
We face global challenges, and be it on migration, on climate change, on security.
If officials here in Brussels could elect a new US president, they would certainly choose Kamala Harris. She promises continuity with Biden's approach on both security and trade, even though many here tell us they do not really know exactly what kind of foreign policy compass Harris has. But if Donald Trump is back in the White House, along with his America First approach, it's more than ever a case of Europe on its own.
The EU Commission has even set up a special unit known as the Trump Task Force to prepare for the fallout of the election. During his first term, Trump imposed levies on steel and aluminum from Europe. Now he is promising to introduce tariffs on all foreign imported products.
The EU will have no choice other than to retaliate, rather than sit down and try to negotiate something like that with a gun to their head. I think a trade war, in the case of a Trump victory, is almost inevitable.
Europeans believe that Kamala Harris understands that tariffs would first and foremost hurt US consumers. They also view her as a strong supporter of Ukraine and NATO, and a leader determined to defend democratic values.
It would be a big win for also joining democratic forces with the European Union and with the United States.
Trump's fascination with authoritarian leaders is seen by many Europeans as a threat to democracy, and his opposition to supporting Ukraine is a source of worry for many on the continent.
He could, for instance, instruct the American military and intelligence services to stop sharing intelligence with Ukraine. This could have potentially far-reaching implications for the war effort by Ukrainian forces, because they'll be denied knowledge about troop movements on the Russian side, etc. He could honestly block shipments of some weapons.
Even though Trump is not likely to pull out of NATO, his repeated questioning of whether he would defend NATO allies has already undermined the alliance, experts say. At NATO headquarters, they are also getting ready for any scenario, with the new NATO chief Mark Rutte making clear he can work with Harris as well as with Trump.
Thanks to him, we pushed up the defense spending, but also what he said on China is now very much taken on board, I think, by many of us.
Europeans understand they will have to invest more in their own defense, regardless of who wins the US election. But with Kamala Harris, many here believe Europe would have an ally in the White House.
Julian Müller-Kaler is an expert on US foreign policy from the German Council on Foreign Relations. How prepared is Europe this time round for another Trump presidency?
Oh, good to be with you again. I think that European decision makers have obviously learned something from the last 4 years and a potential return of Trump to the White House. However, I think it is important to note that the foreign policy differences between Harris and Trump are not that stark as I think a lot of people in Europe might think. That is particularly true when it comes to trade and US foreign policy, with significant implications for European capitals.
Why isn't that difference so stark, or as stark as you believe?
I believe that Trump is more of a symptom than he is a cause in US domestic and foreign policy. I think that there is this renewed belief of more of an isolationist, particularly economic policy, whether you call it America First, as Trump does it, or whether you call it American policy for the middle class, as the Biden administration has. There is a protectionist element now to US foreign policy, which is first and foremost directed at securing and protecting the American middle class in the manufacturing sector. And that will have consequences for Europe. The second, briefly, the second theme is China. We see deglobalization tendencies. We see increased great power competition, particularly in the technology field. European countries are far more dependent on export than the United States is. So they will be the one that first suffer the consequences.
But if Trump does something unexpected, which could highly be likely, the people around him who held him back last time have been greatly fired. The institutions, though, do you think they'll be able to hold him back?
Well, I think the president of the United States has quite a bit of power, particularly when it comes to foreign policy. So I do think that a potential second Trump administration will be less constrained than the first one was. I think he and his team are making a deliberate attempt to have an administration filled with loyalists this time around. I think he was very frustrated 4 years ago, like 8 years ago, when a lot of people were in the administration that did not necessarily share his foreign policy beliefs. And where the president has quite a bit of leeway is in the foreign policy. I think he ultimately does want to be making deals, though. And this is where I see a potential dangerous scenario for Europe, that if they're following suit, particularly with decoupling from China, and then the US makes a deal and the US is left standing on the sidelines, that is potentially a pretty ugly scenario.
How high is the risk of Trump incapacitating NATO, for example?
I think what he will do is he will come up with numbers on how much on defense European allies ought to spend for him to have his commitment in NATO. So ultimately, again, with the deal-making element of it, he could say, well, if you don't pay X amount, I'll pull out of NATO. And he does that in order to get a deal, namely European allies spending more on defense. So I don't necessarily think that the US is likely to pull out of NATO entirely, though I think the demand on European partners to spend more on defense is certainly increasing under the Trump administration.
And what about when it comes to supporting Ukraine in its defenses against Russia?
A similar situation might occur here. I think that he is pressuring Zelensky on the one hand to take any sort of deal that he is likely to negotiate with Putin. However, I also don't think that he necessarily just gives a blanco check to the Russian president, because he wants this to be a deal on his terms and not on Russia terms. They might as well be more likely for Russia to be positive than in any democratic US administration. However, I think that he also might threaten Putin to say, if you don't take the deal that I'm proposing, I'm going to break hell loose in Ukraine. So he's going to force both sides with threats to any sort of deal that he intends to negotiate when he is taking office potentially.
You heard it from Julian Müller-Kaler from the German Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you very much for being on the show again.
We are joined by Marco Overhaus. He's an expert on transatlantic relations at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Thanks for joining us. A second Trump presidency has been described as a potential disaster for Europe's security. Is it, or might it shake things up?
Well, a second Trump presidency would definitely be a situation where conflicts in the transatlantic relationship would become much more acute as compared to what we saw under the Biden presidency, that's for sure. But I think we must not delude ourselves also. I mean, regardless of who becomes president, the United States looks at the world very differently than we in Germany and in many other European countries. The United States continues to see itself as a global power facing global security threats. So China, tensions in the Indo-Pacific, the growing threat from North Korea, all these are seen as the greatest long-term challenges in the United States and not necessarily Ukraine and Europe.
Now, European politicians have long pledged to improve the integration of their defense and foreign policies to prepare for the prospect of a U.S. pullback, regardless of who wins the U.S. presidency. Why haven't they made more progress?
Well, to start on a positive note, I think Europeans have made some progress on security and defense. I mean, defense and military matters have become an integral part of policymaking also in the European Union. For 2024, for the year 2024, NATO is estimating that European NATO allies collectively for the first time will meet their target of spending 2% of their GDP on defense. But there's still a lot to do. I mean, collective defense is still basically outsourced to NATO, where dependencies on the United States are very acute and not sustainable in the long term. And we still don't have a common European foreign policy. We still have, 27 independent national foreign policies, and that's a problem, I think.
How high is the risk of Trump pulling out of NATO? Depending on who you talk to, some people think he won't actually do it. And also in terms of Trump abandoning Ukraine.
I mean, what's sure is that for NATO and for Ukraine, the re-election of Donald Trump would be a much more difficult scenario as compared to the Harris scenario. I personally find it also very unlikely that Trump would pull the United States out of NATO, because in the end, he's not an isolationist. But the problem is with Trump that his security policies are highly contradictory. I mean, he blames the supposed weakness of the Biden administration for Russia's attack on Ukraine, and he's constantly talking also about peace through strength. But at the same time, he's fueling fears of World War III all the time, and Trump also wants to keep U.S. troops out of international conflicts. In my view, that is a contradiction.
Does Europe risk complacency if Harris is elected?
Yes, it does. It does risk complacency. I see this risk. I mean, the United States is still one of Europe's most important foreign policy partners, but America has really changed significantly in recent years and decades. It has become increasingly overstretched by its global security alliances. The United States has become much more protectionist in economic terms, and America's democracy is also under pressure. And all of this means that transatlantic relations will have to be recalibrated no matter what happens on November 5th and who will win the US presidential elections.
Marco Overhaus, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.